Welcome back, everybody. It's time for another deep dive, and today we're looking into a case that has been all over the news lately,
Yeah, that one's a doozy.
the Karen Reed trial. And this is a case that really has a lot of layers to it. So if you haven't been following it already, you're in for a wild ride.
It's got all the elements of a good true crime story.
It does.
You've got love and loss,
Betrayal.
possible police corruption,
Yeah.
small town secrets.
So we're going to break it all down for you today. And, just to give you a taste of what we're dealing with here, imagine being accused of murdering your boyfriend who's a police officer.
Right.
But you believe that his own fellow officers are the ones who are actually responsible.
It's like something out of a movie.
It really is.
But this is real life we're talking about.
Yeah, so we're going to get into all the details, the witness testimonies, the evidence that's been presented, and of course the arguments from both sides.
I think what's really captured the public's attention is the idea that this could be a case of police covering up for one of their own. And that's a story that resonates with a lot of people, especially these days.
Yeah, trust in law enforcement is definitely something that's been in the spotlight a lot recently.
And this case kind of plays into those fears, right? The idea that someone could be framed by the very people who are supposed to protect them.
Right.
It's unsettling, to say the least.
So let's start at the beginning with the incident itself.
Right.
So back in January, Karen's boyfriend, John O'Keefe, who again was a Boston police officer, was found dead in the snow.
A really tragic scene by all accounts.
Yeah, the initial assumption was that it was, sort of an open and shut case of a drunk driving accident.
Right.
But then Karen drops this bombshell that she actually dropped John off at a house party earlier that night.
A party that was being hosted by some of his fellow officers.
Yeah, and this is where the story takes a very sharp turn.
Because now Karen is claiming that John was actually killed inside that house.
And that she was framed for his murder.
It's a pretty bold claim.
It is.
And the defense team has really been going all in on this theory.
They have.
They're pointing to some suspicious Google searches that were made by people at the party.
Yeah, what kind of searches are we talking about here?
Searches related to things like, I think one of them was how to dispose of a body.
Whoa.
Stuff like that.
Oh my gosh.
Very incriminating, if you ask me.
Yeah, it definitely raises some red flags.
And on top of that, the defense is also arguing that the massive public support that Karen has received is a sign that something's not right.
Yeah, the people are really rallying behind her.
They are.
There are protests, there's online campaigns, and the defense is saying, look, this groundswell of support shows that people don't believe the official story.
It's hard to ignore that kind of public outcry.
It is.
Especially when it's so widespread.
So, okay, we've got a potential conspiracy brewing here.
Yeah, we do.
But let's talk about the crime scene itself, because there's a lot of controversy surrounding how that was handled.
Right.
What can you tell us about that?
So the Canton Police Department is the one that handled the scene. And let's just say their methods have raised a lot of eyebrows.
I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, for starters, they apparently used red Solo cups to collect evidence.
You're kidding me, red Solo cups.
Yeah, those iconic party cups.
Oh my gosh.
It doesn't exactly scream forensic expertise, does it?
No, it doesn't sound very professional to me.
And that's not all. There was no crime scene tape put up either.
Really?
So the potential for contamination was incredibly high.
Yeah, anyone could have walked through that scene and messed with the evidence.
Exactly. And even the podcast we listened to for research on this case was like, what is going on here?
They were just baffled.
Yeah, they couldn't believe how poorly the scene was handled.
So it sounds like the crime scene itself is already a big red flag.
It definitely raises a lot of questions about the integrity of the investigation.
And then we've got this missing piece of a taillight.
Right, a piece that supposedly came from Karen's car?
Yeah, and the crucial piece of evidence for the prosecution, because they're claiming it links her to the scene of John's death.
It's their smoking gun, so to speak.
But here's the thing. It wasn't found at the initial scene.
It just kind of magically appeared later on.
That's very convenient for the prosecution, wouldn't you say?
It's definitely suspicious.
So we've got a messy crime scene and some questionable evidence.
That's putting it mildly.
But it gets even more complicated when we start looking at the witness testimonies.
Right, because you've got conflicting accounts coming from both sides.
So what's the prosecution's main argument here?
They're trying to paint a picture of Karen and John's relationship as this kind of drunken roller coaster, always on the verge of exploding.
Okay, so they're trying to portray Karen as being unstable.
And volatile.
And that this instability ultimately led to John's death.
Exactly.
But the defense is pushing back on this narrative pretty hard.
Oh, yeah, they're saying that Karen and John were actually a very loving and supportive couple.
So we've got a classic he said, she said situation.
Right. but with incredibly high stakes.
Absolutely. So let's dive into some of the specific testimonies that stand out. What are some of the things that witnesses have said about Karen and John's behavior that night?
Well, several friends who were at the bar with them that night gave really compelling accounts of them being affectionate with each other.
Okay, so they were seen being lovey-dovey in public.
Yeah, they seemed genuinely happy together, according to these witnesses.
And that doesn't really fit with the prosecution's theory of a heated argument, does it?
Not at all.
Yeah, there was some surveillance footage from the bar that night, too.
Right, and this footage shows John playfully interacting with Brian Albert.
That's the officer who was hosting the party.
The very same.
Okay, so this footage seems to show John in good spirits just hours before his death.
Yeah, it doesn't really support the idea that he was in a fighting mood that night.
So that's a point for the defense for sure.
And then you have the bartender's testimony, which is also interesting.
What did she have to say?
Well, she testified that while everyone was drinking that night, no one seemed overly intoxicated.
Okay, so this kind of challenges the image of a chaotic, alcohol-fueled night that the prosecution is trying to portray.
It does, and it's a really important point for the defense because the prosecution is implying that Karen was too drunk to drive.
Right, and that might have contributed to John's death.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if the bartender is saying that no one seemed that drunk, it kind of weakens the prosecution's argument.
It does, so it seems like these testimonies are really crucial in this case.
They are, because they're painting a very different picture of what happened that night.
And then we have this whole situation with the paramedic firefighter, Katie McLaughlin.
Right. This is where things get really wild.
Yeah, the defense actually accused her of perjury.
They claim that she lied about her relationship with Caitlin Albert.
And Caitlin is a key witness for the prosecution.
Right. She was at the party that night.
So perjury, that's a serious accusation.
It is, and the defense presented photos of McLaughlin and Caitlin together at a beach vacation and a baby shower,
Wow.
which directly contradicts McLaughlin's sworn testimony.
So the defense is saying, look, she lied under oath about this relationship.
And they're arguing that this could taint Caitlin's testimony as well.
Because if McLaughlin is willing to lie about something like this, what else might she be lying about?
It's all about casting doubt.
It is, and this seems like a very risky strategy for the defense.
It is, but if it works, it could really damage the prosecution's case.
Because it makes people question the credibility of their witnesses.
Exactly.
So we've got a messy crime scene, conflicting stories, and now potentially unreliable witnesses.
This case is a real mess.
It is, and there's still a lot more to unpack here.
Oh yeah, we've only just scratched the surface.
So let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll delve even deeper into the evidence and try to piece together what really happened that night.
I'm ready when you are. Okay, so we're back and ready to dig a little deeper into some of the specifics of this case.
Yeah, I feel like we're just getting started with all the twists and turns.
Right. We've talked about the crime scene and the questionable evidence, but now let's zoom in on some of the actual pieces of evidence that have been presented.
Like that broken cocktail glass that was found near John's body.
Yeah, what's the deal with that?
That's a good question, and of course, there are two very different interpretations of what that broken glass means.
As with everything else in this case.
It seems like it.
So the prosecution, they're saying that this glass matches the type of glass that John was using at the bar earlier that night.
Okay.
And they're using this to suggest that he never actually made it inside the Albert house.
So he must have been killed somewhere else.
That's their argument.
But of course, the defense has a counter-argument.
They always do.
What's their take?
Well, they're saying that the police should have searched the Albert house for a matching glass before jumping to conclusions.
That makes sense. I mean, what if there was a matching glass inside the house?
Right. It would completely undermine the prosecution's theory.
So it seems like the defense is really good at poking holes in the prosecution's story.
They're definitely keeping them on their toes.
And speaking of poking holes, remember that missing taillight piece we talked about?
Oh, yeah, that big chunk of red plastic.
That supposedly came from Karen's car.
That was just miraculously found at the scene.
But the witness who cleared the snow that morning testified that he never saw it.
Right, it just kind of appeared out of nowhere.
So how did that happen?
It's a good question, and it really feeds into this idea that the crime scene was mishandled.
And maybe even intentionally manipulated.
It's not beyond the realm of possibility.
And then there's Officer Lank,
The responding officer.
the one with the close ties to the Alberts.
Right.
So he actually admitted to transporting the evidence in a plastic grab-and-go bag.
Instead of a sealed evidence bag.
That's not good.
No, it's not.
I mean, that's pretty basic evidence handling 101, right?
I do think so.
So why didn't he follow protocol?
He said he wasn't sure about the proper procedures for tagging and sealing evidence.
Seriously.
I kid you not.
I mean, that's just alarming to me.
It should be.
It makes you wonder if his connection to the Alberts could have influenced his actions.
Well, the prosecution tried to downplay the significance of that relationship.
How so?
They brought up an incident where Officer Lank had actually filed charges against one of the Albert brothers in a separate case.
Okay, so they're trying to show that he's not afraid to hold them accountable.
Exactly. They're saying, look, he's not giving them special treatment.
But the defense countered that by bringing up an instance where Officer Lank intervened in a fight involving another one of the Albert brothers.
Right. So they're suggesting that there's a more personal, possibly even protective relationship there.
Okay, so it's not just a black and white. He's filed charges against them, so he must be unbiased situation.
Right. There's more to the story.
It seems like this whole case is really less about hard evidence and more about interpretation and credibility.
It really comes down to who the jury believes.
And speaking of believing people, the testimonies about Karen and John's relationship are obviously a huge part of this trial.
They are, because the prosecution is trying to paint this picture of a tumultuous relationship.
Right. They're saying that they were constantly fighting and that this tension ultimately led to John's death.
But the witnesses they've called haven't really supported that narrative.
Like those friends who were at the bar with them.
Yeah, they all said that Karen and John were being affectionate with each other that night.
And these weren't just casual acquaintances, right? These were people who knew them well.
Exactly. They were close friends who had seen them interact as a couple many times before.
And they said they never saw any signs of a rocky relationship.
Not at all.
So that directly contradicts the prosecution's claim of a heated argument that led to John's death.
Right. And it makes you wonder if the prosecution is maybe cherry-picking certain details and ignoring others to fit their version of the story.
And one friend did mention that Karen was annoyed with John's family
Oh, yeah. What was that about?
because they weren't helping enough with his niece and nephew.
The ones he was raising?
Right. So the prosecution might try to use that to suggest that there was tension in John and Karen's lives.
Yeah, but it seems like a bit of a stretch to me.
I mean, it's a detail that could be interpreted in different ways.
For sure.
But remember, the defense countered that by showing the surveillance footage from the bar.
The footage that showed John playfully fighting with Brian Albert.
Exactly. And that footage suggests that John was in good spirits just hours before his death.
So it kind of throws a wrench in the prosecution's theory of a fight between Karen and John.
And then there's the bartender's testimony.
Oh, yeah, she's a key witness.
What did she say again?
She said that while everyone was drinking that night, no one in the group seemed overly intoxicated.
And this is huge for the defense.
It is.
Because it undermines the prosecution's claim that Karen was too drunk to drive.
And that she might have accidentally hit John.
If she wasn't excessively drunk, as multiple witnesses have suggested.
It becomes much harder to believe that she would have hit him with her car and left him to die in the snow.
So all these seemingly insignificant moments are suddenly incredibly important.
They are, because this case is about building a timeline.
Understanding the relationships between the people involved.
And scrutinizing every piece of evidence.
To see if it supports or contradicts the narratives being presented.
It's like a giant puzzle.
With a lot of missing pieces.
And we're all trying to figure out how they fit together.
And we can't forget about the power of perception.
Right.
The defense has done a really good job of planting seeds of doubt.
Highlighting inconsistencies.
And suggesting alternative explanations for the evidence.
It's a classic legal strategy.
Dismantle the prosecution's case piece by piece.
And they've created this alternative narrative that's really resonating with the public.
It makes you wonder if there's something darker going on here.
Something the prosecution is trying to hide.
It's like a true crime puzzle.
And we're all trying to put the pieces together.
But with each new testimony and each new piece of evidence,
the picture gets more complicated instead of clearer. That's what makes this case so compelling.
There's this constant back and forth.
With each side presenting their interpretation of the facts.
And ultimately, it's up to the jury to decide what they believe.
And to determine Karen's fate.
Before we get to the jury's deliberations, we need to talk about the testimonies of Brian Albert's brother, Chris, and his wife, Julie.
Okay, so they were both at the bar that night.
And their accounts add another layer of complexity to this already intricate story.
So where do we start?
Let's start with Chris.
Okay.
He testified that Karen didn't appear to be highly intoxicated that night.
Interesting.
Which supports her claim that she was capable of driving.
Right, because the prosecution is arguing that she was too drunk to be behind the wheel.
So Chris's testimony directly contradicts that.
But there was a discrepancy in Chris's timeline compared to the surveillance footage.
What kind of discrepancy?
He said he went home around 12:05 or 12:10 a.m.
Okay.
But the footage showed him leaving the bar closer to 12:14 a.m.
So a few minutes difference.
Yeah, but even a small discrepancy like that can raise doubts.
The prosecution loves to find those little inconsistencies.
Oh yeah, they'll use anything they can to discredit a witness.
And then there's Julie's testimony.
Okay, what does she have to say?
Well, she remembers Karen smuggling a drink into the bar.
Oh, that's not good.
Yeah. It suggests that she might have been drinking more than it initially appeared.
The prosecution is definitely going to use that to their advantage,
They'll say, look, she was trying to hide how much she was drinking.
which implies that she knew she was drinking too much.
Exactly.
But here's where it gets even more interesting.
I'm listening.
During cross-examination, the prosecution brought up Julie's contact with a state trooper who was at the time under internal investigation.
Wait, what?
Yeah, you heard that right.
Okay, so Julie was in contact with a potentially compromised state trooper.
It raises a lot of questions.
It does. Why was she talking to him?
What did they discuss?
It definitely casts a shadow of doubt over Julie's testimony.
And by extension, the prosecution's case as a whole.
So it's like we're peeling back the layers of an onion here.
Every new revelation just adds more complexity and intrigue.
What do you make of this connection with the state trooper?
It's hard to say for sure what it means, but the defense is going to try to use it to their advantage.
Of course they will.
They'll probably argue that this contact raises serious concerns about the integrity of the entire investigation.
I mean, if one of the witnesses is connected to potentially corrupt state trooper.
It makes you wonder if there's something fishy going on.
It is worth noting that this state trooper was brothers with Julie's close friend, Courtney.
Oh, wow. So there's another layer of interconnectedness here.
It's like a tangled web of relationships.
It's definitely suspicious.
So the prosecution is going to have to provide a very convincing explanation for this connection.
If they want to maintain their credibility.
Because so far the defense has done a brilliant job of challenging their narrative at every turn.
They've highlighted inconsistencies
Suggested alternative explanation.
and raised serious doubts about the credibility of key witnesses.
Like a classic David and Goliath situation.
The defense is using every tool at their disposal to fight back against a powerful system.
That might be trying to silence them.
And it's a reminder that in the legal system, things aren't always what they seem.
The truth can be elusive.
And justice isn't always guaranteed.
This case is a perfect example of that.
It's a tangled web of relationships.
Conflicting accounts.
Questionable evidence.
It reminds us that we need to be critical thinkers.
Question what we're told.
Consider different perspectives.
And demand accountability from those in positions of power.
Well said. And we're getting close to the end of our deep dive into this fascinating, complicated case. All right, so we've talked about the crime scene, the evidence, and the witnesses. But now let's get to the closing arguments.
This is where it all comes together.
Each side gets their last chance to persuade the jury.
To try and convince them of their version of events.
Exactly. So let's start with the prosecution. What were their key points?
Well, they really doubled down on this narrative of a troubled, alcohol-fueled relationship.
They're still pushing that angle.
Oh, yeah. They kept saying that Karen's drinking led to this tragic accident.
And they brought up Julie's testimony again, right?
Yes, the one where she remembered Karen smuggling a drink into the bar.
They're using that to suggest that Karen was trying to hide her level of intoxication.
And that she knew she was drinking too much.
So they're trying to paint her as reckless and irresponsible.
Exactly. They want the jury to see her as someone who doesn't think about the consequences of her actions.
And they also brought up the inconsistencies in Chris's timeline.
Right. They pointed out that his testimony didn't quite match up with the surveillance footage.
You're trying to chip away at his credibility.
Because if the jury starts to doubt Chris's testimony, it weakens Karen's case.
But did they have any direct evidence linking Karen to John's death?
Not really, but they kept emphasizing the fact that a piece of her taillight was found at the scene.
And they argued that this, combined with the testimony about her drinking, pointed to a drunk driving accident.
It's all circumstantial evidence, but they're saying it's enough to convict her.
But the defense had a very different story to tell.
Oh yeah, they came back swinging.
What was their strategy?
They focused on the missteps in the investigation, the chaotic crime scene, the red Solo cups used to collect evidence, the lack of crime scene tape.
They're basically saying, don't trust the evidence.
Because the people who collected it didn't know what they were doing, or maybe they had something to hide.
And they brought up those conflicting testimonies about Karen and John's relationship.
Right. They reminded the jury that Multiple friends testified that the couple was happy and affectionate at the bar.
Which contradicts the prosecution's theory of a volatile, argumentative relationship.
And then there's the bartender who said that no one seemed overly intoxicated.
That really undermines the prosecution's whole argument about Karen being too drunk to drive.
It does.
So the defense did a good job of planting seeds of doubt.
They made the jury question everything.
And they also hinted at a different theory of what happened to John.
They suggested that he might have been killed inside the Albert house.
And that the evidence was planted to make it look like Karen was responsible.
They never explicitly said it, but they definitely implied it.
And they ended by reminding the jury that the prosecution had the burden of proof.
They have to prove Karen's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
And the defense argued that they had failed to do so. So after weeks of testimony and all this evidence, the case went to the jury.
It must have been a tough decision.
They deliberated for 3 days.
3 days, that's a long time.
They must have been really wrestling with all the different possibilities.
I can't imagine what that must have been like.
And the verdict is,
Not guilty.
Karen Read was found not guilty of all charges.
It was a huge victory for the defense.
And a major blow to the prosecution.
This case really captured the public's attention.
It raised a lot of questions about police accountability.
And the power of public perception.
It shows that even when the odds are stacked against you,
You can still fight for the truth.
and that's a powerful message.
It is, and it's something we should all keep in mind as we navigate this complex world.
Well said. And that's it for our deep dive into the Karen Read trial.
It's been a wild ride.
It has. We'll be back soon with another fascinating case. But until then, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep those minds sharp.